Yeah.
Okay, am I permitted to sit elsewhere? Okay, thank you. Now. So I'm here told that. You told the same about. Yes, so I'm going to enjoy it. I'll just tell because we're about to start. So are you joining or not? Good afternoon, everyone. We thank you for the honor to be with us on this panel. And we are supposed to have 4 people on this panel, but one person has volunteered or decided to opt out. And so we will be having 3 people on this panel. The panel is on Dissent, Decoloniality and Censorship in Kannywood, part 1. We are going to be having 2 panels for this discussion, and the other one is at 3:45. So this is the first part of the presentation, and I have 3 people here. The first person on the list is Dr. Martina Omorodion from Federal University, Oye-Ekiti. She's going to be talking to us on censorship, cancel culture, and Kannywood, policing women's body through social media. Dr. Martina is a fresh doctoral product of University of Oye-Ekiti. So she'll be talking to us about that. The second presenter on the list is Dr. Carmen Talatu McCain. She is going to be talking to us on discourses of decoloniality in Kannywood, censorship and resistance. She is from the University of London, so thank you. And the third person is going to be talking on dissenting bodies, satirical renderings of dance in selected Kannywood films. Her name is Pyrat Okola Yusuf from Bayero University. Thank you for joining this panel. And so, my name is Rukayat Banjo from the Department of Theatre and Performing Arts, Bayero University. And thank you. I'll be chairing this panel. So I'll go with Dr. Martina Omorodion first, and she's going to be talking to us on censorship, cancel culture, and Kannywood, policing women's bodies through social media. Each of the presenters will have 15 minutes, yes, for their presentations, and we'll take comments and suggestions, observations afterwards. Thank you. Oh, do you want me to go with another person? Okay, she's not ready. I'm not ready. So we go with Dr. Carmen McCain. She's going to be discussing discourses of coloniality in Kannywood, censorship, and resistance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I have written quite a lot on.
Hello, please. Thank you.
I've written quite a lot on the Kano State censorship board crisis from 2007 to 2011. So I was really struggling with this paper to do something different from what I've already written and published. So I'm taking a more historical and kind of theoretical approach. And hopefully I'm glad that we have a little bit more time to discuss afterwards if you want more specific examples. If you could do the next slide, please. Okay. So in philosopher Olufemi Taiwo's pugnacious new book against decolonization, taking African agency seriously, he lays out two working definitions of decolonization. The first definition, which he calls decolonization 1, refers to the struggles leading up to formal independence from the colonial state, becoming a, quote, self-governing entity with its political and economic fortunes under its own directions, end quote. The second definition, decolonization 2, he refers to as being the ideological attempt to disentangle life in the former colony from the history of colonialism. This kind of decolonization, he asserts, associates any sort of Western influence with colonial imposition rather than acknowledging the agency and how people in former colonies choose to interact with their past. The ultimate goal of decolonization, too, he argues, is that it is complete, quote, only after all forms of domination are overturned, end quote, making decolonization equivalent to human emancipation. He critiques the expansiveness of the term, arguing that it has, quote, become a catch-all trope, often used to perform contemporary morality or authenticity, end quote. So while I think Taiwo's argument is sometimes too dismissive of concerns about the legacies of colonialism, I do think his distinction here is useful in thinking about how the discourse of decolonization has been used in conversations about film in Africa in two ways. First, that of building independent infrastructure that is not reliant on foreign funding, which seems in line with his definition of decolonization 1. So kind of the formal structures of decolonization. And second, ideological concerns about foreign influence on creative production, which seems more in line with his critique of decolonization 2. I will begin this paper with some background on the conversations from the 1970s and 80s about decolonizing filmmaking on the continent in order to examine how both censors and filmmakers in northern Nigeria wielded the language of decolonization in oppositional ways. In his seminal book, and if you could go to the next one. In his seminal book, 1987 book, Film in Nigeria, Hyginus Ekwazi ends his chapter on the decolonization of Nigerian/African film with the observation that, quote, the distribution slash exhibition network in Africa exists primarily to service foreign film. It's the one before that. As against this problem, he calls for a, quote, reorganization and revitalization of the African film industry, if only to effectively indigenize the technology and institutions of the cinema, end quote. Remember, this is before Nollywood was widespread. He also calls for an African film language that will reflect African traditions, arguing that both interventions will lead, quote, ultimately to a comprehensive decolonization of African film. So distribution networks and a new sort of film language. Ekwazi's arguments were aligned with those of the collective of third world filmmakers who issued a series of decolonial manifestos in the 1970s. In the 1973 manifesto in Algiers, the Committee on People's Cinema expressed concern over cultural imperialism from Western countries. They believed that the passive consumption of foreign media was alienating audiences from their cultures. They pointed out the necessity to be, quote, vigilant and to eliminate nefarious actions of the information media, to purify the forms of popular expression, folklore, music, theater, etc., and to modernize them, end quote. These calls to reclaim ideological and cultural influence in films without taking into consideration the agency of the audiences who appropriated them, and we can think of Kannywood with singing and dancing, seems in line with Taiwo's definition of decolonization too. However, the primary focus in 1973 and later in the 1975 Algiers Charter on African Cinema was less on shutting down creative production and more on building infrastructure for African films to thrive apart from the institutions of Europe and the US, a goal that seems to be in line with what Taiwo calls decolonization one. So they were more interested in building infrastructure than, and so if the earlier language of elimination and purification in the 1973 manifesto seems censorious, in the 1975 Algiers Charter on African Cinema, they clarified that they were not calling for censorship or, quote, any other form of coercion likely to diminish the filmmaker's creative scope, end quote. So the charter therefore seems to privilege the creative expression of the filmmakers over the ideological need to completely separate themselves from any sort of outside influence. So I've given a somewhat extended background on the decolonizing conversations of the 1970s and 80s in order to provide context for the later discussions that arose in relation to the independent film industries of Nollywood and Kannywood. These industries seemingly fulfilled, even if briefly, the hopes of the filmmakers in Algiers and film theorists like Hyginus Ekweazi for Africa-based structures of production and distribution. Although, of course, these independent structures are now challenged by streaming platforms like Netflix, Amazon, Paramount, etc., which I think the keynote speaker really passionately and beautifully spoke to yesterday. While independent cultural movements and industries that grew up with little outside support thrived for a few decades, the interference of the state, which the Third World Filmmakers Collective had idealized, was often more ideological than practically supportive. And I will focus the rest of my time on examining these discourses of decolonization wielded by both the Kano State Censorship Board and their suppression of artists in Kano, and also by the creative producers in response to the censors. So you can go to the next slide. The Kano State Censorship Board was birthed out of the re-implementation of Sharia law in Kano State, the advocacy of which itself used the language of decolonization. So Sani Yarima, who became governor of Zamfara State in 1999, immediately following Nigeria's return to democratic rule, strategically campaigned on the implementation of Sharia law. And he used the language of decolonization and human rights. So he said Sharia was the opportunity for Muslims to have, quote, freedom to exercise their full rights since the period the North was invaded and colonized by the British. So his political campaign became a widespread rallying cry for Sharia across northern Nigeria, in part because people believed a religious law in place before colonialism would be more just than a corrupted legal system imposed during colonialism. And this too probably turned out to be overly idealistic. The burgeoning Hausa film industry was a target for critics who idealized a return to a supposedly pristine pre-colonial culture. Cinema culture was associated with drinking and dancing of the barracks and sabongari, spaces established for, quote, foreigners by colonial rule. The Hausa film industry was, by extension, seen as a legacy of a lifestyle brought by colonialism and as simply copycatting powerful film industries like Hollywood or Bollywood. So Kannywood filmmakers were lumped in with foreigners. In one Sharia implementation report, it was recommended that the government should close cinemas and stop video distribution. The concern was that, quote, these institutions have great corrupting influence on youth, and that they serve as a meeting place for criminal elements, end quote. And so this resulted after Sharia was implemented in Kano in 2001 in a ban on film production and distribution, which led to kind of the first big crisis in Kano. So here we see that the state was more focused on the ideological fears about foreign influence, decolonization too, than they were interested in the flourishing independent infrastructure that had been built up by filmmakers to this point. See decolonization one. So in response to the 2001 ban on film production and distribution, the Hausa film community went to the government. They presented the numbers of people who would be unemployed if such a ban was to go into place. And they came to the agreement and negotiation to create a censorship board. So the censorship board itself was part of a proposal by the filmmakers so that they could keep working. So these negotiations ended up in the founding of the Kano State Censorship Board. And so while the motivation came with Islamic law, the language most often used, so in kind of public discussions by the censorship board was that of protecting vulnerable population from the influence of cultural imperialism. So the censorship crisis that happened from 2007 to 2011 that I'm most familiar with, because this is during my PhD research. And as I think a lot of you probably know, it was instigated by a sex scandal. I won't go into all that now. But it pushed this rhetoric to an extreme under the leadership of Abu Bakr Rabo Abdul Karim, who was the previous deputy head of the Kano Hizba. And so in an interview with me, he told me that the state banned, quote, all alien dancing, all alien cultures that were smuggled into our projects, end quote, because they jeopardized the societal values of the Hausa. He also said that if the, quote, attitudinal culture was poisoned, or if it is being adulterated in these creative arts, obviously there will come a time when House of Fulani will have no place to be traced, displaying fears about the encroachment on the supposed purity of what he called a, quote, clean and respected plan, end quote, of the House of Fulani. So that somehow there was this existential threat to the existence of the House of Fulani by the film industry. So while the fears against cultural imperialism echo the decolonial language of the filmmakers from the 1970s, the effect of this legislation was to suppress a flourishing indigenous industry and reify the discriminatory language of ethnic superiority. The newly established agency, Adede Tasaho, a ministry for societal reorientation, held several book burnings. Okay, great, you got it. Including one at a state school where representatives of the state burned Hausa novels confiscated from students and replaced them, yay, with didactic books published by the government. So the corruption of the film industry was blamed not only on foreign influence, but on the non-Hausa ethnicities involved in the film industry. So there was discussion about, oh, the Yoruba and the film industry, right? For example, then Kano State Governor Ibrahim Shekarau claimed that, quote, some of the artists and producers of the Hausa movies are not indigents of the state. So there was this language of indigeneity that was being used. Indeed, the censors board ended up exacerbating and reifying ethnic and religious differences using identitarian politics that coincided with the colonial divide and rule politics that the Algiers filmmakers criticized in their 1973 manifesto. And so one of the things they said in that was that, quote, imperialism has endeavored to play on the pseudo-racial and community differences, assigning one or another ethnic grouping. So thus, while the censorship board and its enablers used the language of decolonization, they were in fact behaving more like the colonizers. So Hausa artists responded to censorship in language that, if not specific, they weren't really saying decolonization, right? But it took the part of ordinary people suffering under an oppressive government. So writers, because the censorship board was for everyone, not just filmmakers, but writers, when they told they were supposed to submit their writing to the censorship board before they published it, went on strike, right? Musicians, and I think you can go to the next slide. Musicians and filmmakers made rebellious music that responded to the censorship board, including one anonymous CD that prayed down curses on those who kept them from their livelihood. It was banned in Kano, but I found it in Jos. And then the claims of authenticity. So the board was saying this is kind of the authentic Hausa culture. But of course, these films were not just being made in Kano, and even within Kano, there's no one authentic culture, right? So the filmmaker Abbas Sadiq, for example, pointed out to me that he had grown up in Jos, he wore jeans, he listened to hip hop, and that the life portrayed in his films reflected his own experience and the experiences of many other Hausa youth. Yet he and other filmmakers were accused of spoiling Hausa culture. At the end of the that particular censorship crisis, right? There have been more since, which hopefully we'll hear about here. At the end of that censorship crisis in 2011, films came out that you can go to the next slide, that directly and indirectly reference the crisis, including a docudrama that retold the travails of filmmaker Hamiso Lamido Iyantama, who was imprisoned by the censorship board for 3 months and went through like a 2 or 3 year process of challenging that report. And in this film, he aligned filmmakers with ordinary people who were suffering under the injustice of government and showed Igbo businessmen and women as sympathetic supporters against the provincial and discriminatory censors. So he consciously kind of draws himself as a cosmopolitan. The comedian Ibro, who was also arrested by the censors board, obliquely referenced his arrest in a comedy where he pretended to be a rogue judge going around and arresting people off the street and indicting them with a book of English law that they couldn't understand. So thus tying the government and the censors board that had arrested him to the colonial legacy. And there are many examples of this. Hopefully we'll hear a few more. So filmmakers projected themselves as contributing to, quote, education, information, and consciousness raising that the filmmakers in Algiers had written into their manifesto, and often very critical of corruption in the government and so on. And they began to seek out opportunities in other parts of the nation and began to identify as Nigerian filmmakers who had the freedom to distribute their films in the 35 other states of the nation, even if they couldn't distribute them in Kano. And there's a lot more I could say. I'm about out of time, so I'll just say it didn't end there. As my colleagues will point out, unfortunately, filmmakers are not freedom fighters, and they've often compromised with conservative critics to scapegoat women and to pass guild laws that have made it more difficult for them to work with filmmakers in other parts of Nigeria. So it's an ongoing struggle. But I did think it was interesting that the censorship board itself used the language of decolonization, and then the filmmakers responded kind of using the same language. So I'm looking forward to hearing these other papers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hune, for that detailed historical perspective of colonization and decoloniality in Kannywood. We'll listen to other speakers, after which we'll take questions and comments. Are you ready? Okay. Okay. So now we will take Dr. Martina Omorodion. She's going to be talking to us about censorship, cancel culture, and Kannywood. Policing women's bodies through social media. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martina Omorodion. So, this is a paper I'm developing, and I will just talk through it and share my ideas, the work in progress. So it's titled Censorship, Cancel Culture, and Kannywood. Resisting the policing of women's body through social media. So this paper has focused the primary actress, Rahama Sadwa from Kano State. And since 2016, she has been in the eye of the storm over, in quotes, indecent conduct. Rahama has been banned from Kannywood 2 times. And according to her, the ban has shot her into limelight. What this paper seeks to address now is the identity formation of a woman, or gender formation from the private space to the public space. We should remember and bear in mind that Rahama is an actress, and as an actress is regulated to play different roles and pick on different identities. And so then the line is, the paper asks, where do we draw the line between what is a private individual self and the public perception of her? One of the first reasons she was banned in 2016 was because she was caught in an improper physical contact with a musician, a jazz-based musician called Classic. So she had hugged him when she was in music video vixen. We should bear in mind that a part of the country, especially in Kannywood, there are strict laws on women and men interactions in movies. For example, you cannot allow holding of hands and some certain moves. But Rahama broke that, and she got into the eye of storm, and then she was banned. But due to that ban, she shot into limelight on the same social media because the news was carried and people noticed that. Then in 2020, which my paper picks up from, she posted a picture, a personal picture of herself. I'm supposed to show a slide of that picture, and she was dressed in a gown, her hair uncovered. It's a backlit gown with her back opened, but every other part covered. And that caused a lot of controversy. It caused a serious controversy that trended some hashtags against it, and people condemned her for making them sing. Like one of the tweets I analyzed, for this paper, I analyzed different tweets, and they condemned her for making them sing with their eyes. So in this space, I look at Rahama, because this is the second time she's doing this, resisting the policing of women's body through social media. So she uses the same social media, same controversy that puts her into a spot where she's rejected and condemned. Because at the end of it all, she had to apologize while crying. And we noticed the transition that she's fully clothed. to moving her into limelight when she has now been noticed by the Western media. She moved from Kannywood into Hollywood. The people essentially asked, where do we now limit a woman's presentation of herself? As an actress, she has been perfect in addressing and her presentation of herself and in acting to the rules and conventions of the society. But as a personal person, the society still tries to dictate the limits of what she can do and the limits of where she can go, probably because the society is one based on women's invisibility. Women cannot be seen and cannot be held in quotes. At the end of this paper, I'm just going to look at it. I will be analyzing the tweets and see to what extent Rama has been able to move and conquer the public perception of women and the policing of women's body. Thank you.
All right, we move on to Hirat Okola's presentation on dissenting bodies, satirical renderings of dance in selected Kannywood.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, sir and ma. The title of my paper is Dissenting Bodies, Satirical Renderings of Dance in Selected Kannywood Films. I will start by saying that dance is a conscious and an unconscious activity. And for an action to be viewed as dance, it has some features. These features are one, the body. The body, the second one is movement, the third one is space, the fourth one is rhythm, and the last one is force or energy. Now, when we talk about body in dance, this is the physical frame of the dancer. And the body is the only instrument and the personal instrument that a dancer has to be able to express an emotion, a feelings, or a sentiment, or a philosophy. The other one is about movement. When we talk about movement in dance, we are talking about the body having to perform an action, moving from one point to another. And okay, where do I
press down, up.
Okay. And when we talk about movement in dance, it requires the dancer having to perform a particular action with the physical body in motion. The idea of space in dance brings us to where the dancer is occupying at the moment in time that the person is expressing a particular movement. Space can be either core and it can either be a peripheral. When a dancer decides to dance within a particular frame within the body, it means it is core because the person is just dancing within the reach. But when a dancer extends the use of space, they extend the movement from one point to another to reach out, it means it is the peripheral space. And according to Isadora Duncan, one of the modern dancer, the person said that a dancer, the swimming pool, the space is a swimming pool for a dancer to be able to actually express all of the ideas, all of the feelings. The concept of rhythm has to do with either internal or external. We Africans, our dances are majorly complemented with our music, and this music they are used in such a way that it could punctuate the body movement, it could equally give transition and all of that. And in some of this rhythm, some of the musical instruments that try to play out can be aerophone, which is the flute, idiophone, which is the rattle, the cordophone, which is the gong, or the aerophone, the membranophone, which are the drums. The concept of energy in dance or force is the amount of energy a dancer tries to exert in producing a particular movement. So when a dancer decides to put a whole lot of energy on a movement, it can produce a percussive body movement, it can produce a transitory body movement, it can equally produce a collapsed body movement or a vibratory body movement. All of these are things that actually play out in both stage performances of dance and equally on the screen. My interest in dance in Kannywood films was as a result of so many people have looked at some of these Kannywood films, and the idea of dance is often jettisoned. And in the recent times, one of the dominant elements in Kannywood films is dance. So I brought up an idea of, okay, if others are looking at this particular area, I can also look at this particular area to be able to fill a gap. And equally, because of the notion people have about dance when it comes to in Kannywood films. For instance, we have dance, seeing dance as a mere manipulation of the body, as a sort of embellishment, dance as just mesmerizing the sight, dance as a pastime engagement, and dance as a mere imitation. So from a critical perspective, dance in some Kannywood films is beyond this existing notion. And dances in films like Mariam, produced in 2018 by Ali Nuhu, and Lamba, produced in 2022 by Ali Gumzat, have lent the bodies to expose flaws. Flaws in the sense that some of these attitudes, some of these things that has to do with human behavior, flaws like deception, stealing, cheating, bullying, and even greed, in hope of actually transforming the minds of their viewers. So this study aims at examining the messages of satirical dances in the film Mariam and Lamba. The theoretical framework we use that this work is anchored on is reader's response theory. And this theory emerged in Germany and the United States in the 1960s. The reader's response theory takes a reader-based approach to textual analysis. The framework holds that meaning is constructed through a transaction between the reader and the text within a particular context. I will like to show you some of the video clips of the dances to further portray my idea before I conclude. So please. No, the first one. You can look at the next one. Take time. So you move to the last part. No, the last part. Sorry, excuse me. No, open permitted. Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
I would like to apologize. The other one, where the dance is, he said it does not have a way to fast forward. So I would like to apologize, and I would like to conclude by saying that dance in Kannywood films, you can pause this. Pause, please. Pause, please. I would like to say that in conclusion, dance actually is driven by a theme or a subject matter in some of these Kannywood films we have selected. I thank you for listening.
Thank you. The speakers have spoken, and we will take questions, we'll take comments, we'll take observations for viewers. Okay, we're going to take 4. Okay, in a round, number 1, number 2, number 3. Do we have a 4th person in the house? No. Okay, so we're just going to take the 3 questions and probably further questions would arise from that. All right, number 1. Okay.
The popular Yoruba singer, Sonia said, I really joke that if you don't stand still, that means you are dancing. What's the definition of dancing? It says that as long as you are not standing still, you are dancing, which means that there are different dimensions of dancing, depending on the degrees of gyration, right? The problem here is that Kannywood is saying the degree of the body movement determines how you are going to perceive the dancer, right? So the video portrayed here, when I saw it, what I said in my mind, I said out is that Hausa ti Jasi. When you say Hausa ti Jasi, that means they have become dynamic. I told someone here, I said, I don't like watching Kannywood, but if I go to see this, I'll watch it over and over. So, something about censorship, something about making something secret it makes it more enjoyable. I think it was Mariam Abba in a so long letter that says secret love is sweet. She said she would rather want the husband to bring in the concubine, that when it is still secretive, it will enjoy it. But immediately the woman comes home, it will no longer be as enjoyable as when he was hiding. So I think this censorship makes it more enjoyable, especially for the youth. How can we hide things that are already on the YouTube? Even if they don't watch Kannywood, they will watch Yoruba movies. They'll watch Igbo movies. They'll watch American movies. So I think my personal opinion, I know these things are being done because of religion, because of culture, because of beliefs. But the thing is that in a bid to ensure censorship, we are trying to create more interest in the minds of the kids. My first daughter told me, when they were young, what we used to do is that we know they could understand Yoruba. But if my husband and I want to converse in a way they will not understand, we'll go to our dialect, Ekiti dialect. And my first daughter said, while doing that, she made herself to understand our conversation. She took more time to listen, and she was able to get meanings out of it. So when we're being secretive about things, we're creating interest in people to want to know more. What is that thing that you are hiding? I must know it. So in sum, I want to say that in the definition of Sonia Day, Aiduro Nijo, not standing still is dancing. And while trying to censor things, we want to try and see, we want to try and remember that secret love is sweet. I'm Kike Lomadeni from Lagos State University of Education. Thank you.
Number 2. Number 2. Okay, thank you. My name is Decoloniality Cousin from Bayero University, Kano. I have, let me say, a poster to the first 2 presenters, Professor McCain and Dr. Martina. Listening to your presentations, I could see a form of intersection between discourses on censorship and resistance in Kannywood and the issue of Ramatu Sadao that you brought up. And I want to ask Professor McCain, what are the dynamics of resistance in Kannywood? If you are having a kind of discourse on Kannywood, and what is the present issue of resistance and censorship in Kannywood? We need to understand, we need to understand the before and the present in order to find a way of continue with the film industry. So what is the dynamics of censorship and resistance in Kannywood as at present? For anybody who is interested in Kannywood film or Kannywood study, how do we understand the film industry? And secondly, to Dr. Martina, I attended a conference and this issue of can we censor social media came up, particularly as it relates to Kannywood. I'm very certain that the idea of censorship in Kannywood limits itself to the film, essentially the home videos produced by the filmmakers in the Kano film industry. And when the issue of Ramatu Sadao came up, you will now realize that the scope is like the censorship board went out of their scope, because this is something that came up in another sector, which is the entertainment sector. It has nothing to do with the film sector. But then, because this particular person happens to be an actor in their industry, they decide to punish her for participating in another sector. But then, this happened on the social media. So what is the policy of Kannywood on social media censorship? Do they have that power to transit to censoring filmic or entertainment activities within the social media space? So I want us to have a conversation regarding that. And lastly, to the last presenter, it's actually fascinating that dance is something that is relegated not only in by people in northern Nigeria. I think it's general. I believe dance could communicate different kind of things, and satire is another way using dance to communicate flaws or social vices. And I just want to ask, do they really use dance in Kannywood to communicate some of these social vices? And if they do, how do we practitioners enhance or improve their rendition of dance to communicate social vices and provide solution to some of these things? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we take all the questions?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chair, Doctor. My name is Dr. Dahiru Rabe from the Federal University of Kaduna State. My one is quite observations as well as questions. So I have some observations on the presentations and also some certain questions that I may need the presenters maybe to add or to shed more light or to add more picture of the whole idea of decoloniality and also Kannywood censorship. First of all, let me start with the last presenter. Sorry. The issue of dance in Kannywood, I think if we look at it in its present context, so censorship and its appearance in Kannywood is like a symbiosis of transcultural issue, in the sense that Hausa community, where Kannywood is located, has tradition of dancing. But which type of dance? Is this the dance we are looking in the Kannywood today, or is it another kind of dances? So throughout the history of Hausa people, they have history of dance, and their dances connote a lot of meaning and a lot of explanation of the culture. So the one we are seeing in Kannywood, definitely it is given enough enough consideration, we will understand that what it leads, it is taking away what Hausa community or what Hausa society has been transforming itself into. Because Hausa society, not as ethnic group, as a nation, is evolving over time and it's evolving with its culture. And Kannywood is a kind of a hybrid picture of the present Hausa culture. But most of the dances or most of the issues in Hausa dance are more or less Indians. The way we are just seeing are more or less Indians in their own context than Hausa itself. So maybe that is one of the reasons it has some clash with the original Hausa dances. So maybe the presenter may shed more light on how she attempt to explain Hausa as a recent, as a philosophy of the Hausa people, or how, especially in Kannywood. And then the second presenter, that is Dr. Martina. Please, I will only say one, two. In as much as if you consider Rahama Sadao as a single, or you single out Rahama Sadao case as a picture of, let's say, policing, or what do you call the other one? Policing or censorship in house life. I think we might end up reaching a wrong conclusion. Since you have made your point clear that you are developing a paper, I would suggest that you look at the broader cases of issues similar to Rahama Sadao in Kannywood than only singular Rahama Sadao, because Rahama Sadao issue is a complicated issue. In most of the accusation or most of the observations that are done, which attracted what we call, what we may call censorship or cancel culture, is Rahama Sadao herself apologizes in many instances as a result of that. And she apologized because in some context, you look at it that she has even transcended the boundary of the Hausa culture, not even religious consideration. So she apologized sometime for what she did. So maybe we select some other cases and compare, and then we can give a clear picture of if the censorship and the cancel culture can start on its own. And lastly, to Professor McKen, here I will just ask a question. Professor or Progma, in the censorship or in the coloniality context, Kannywood we will say they have a robust perimeter, because they are allowed to imbibe a lot of or many cultures outside the context of Hausa community. And if you look at the apparatus or the instruments they use in their dancing and drumming, they have nothing to do with Hausa culture. Also, the way they dance, it has nothing to do with the Hausa culture. In fact, even the expressions and the dances they conducted, they have nothing to do with Hausa culture. So in as much as we look at the issue of religious restrictions on Kannywood, on some of the Kannywood activities, I think it is not general, because I can tell you there are a lot of issues in Kannywood that are not part of that are not in tandem with the religious teachings, religious laws, but they are allowed to continue in Kannywood. If you go, let me give an example. If you go into the society of Kano and its neighbors, you will find out in almost every house, every home in Hausa, in Kano and its environment, you will find that people are entertaining Hausa Kannywood films. And you can observe that if you had the children on the street, even in schools, everywhere, they are repeating and regurgitating a lot of this Kannywood issues. So I think to take the idea of maybe legal restriction or legal censorship of Kannywood issues is not absolute, rather it is relative. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we take questions from the floor person.
Thank you. I really enjoy this set of papers. I was attracted to this panel. I've not been disappointed. So thank you guys for a wonderful job. Yes, I want to talk briefly about on McKean's paper first. I want to start with Dr. McKean's paper. Certainly at the time that these actors, whom you and I know very well, this set of Rabu Abdul Karim and Shekaro and the rest of them, Bala Muhammad, at the time that these actions were taking place, decolonization had not become a buzzword, in academia, hadn't resonated to the extent that it has. That we're talking about the second Taiwo iteration or definition of decolonization, not the first one, right? It hadn't become such an influential theoretical formulation. So I was wondering, whether it occurred to them that what they were doing at the time, given the fact that decoloniality hadn't become this big influential theory, to what extent did it occur to them that, in fact, that's what they were doing, that their project, this project of censorship, could be framed in this way as a form of decoloniality or decolonization? And were they self-conscious about it? Or was this just a justificatory rhetoric that they, used to, kind of legitimize what they were trying to do, what they were trying to accomplish? The second part of it is that, I'm curious, given just how popular decolonization has become as a theoretical formulation, what would Rabu Abdul Karim, Dr. Bala Muhammad, Governor Shekaro, or ex-Governor Shekaro, what would they think today? What would they feel vindicated? Well, seriously, I'm just wondering aloud. Would they feel vindicated? Like, look, we were ahead of everybody. We were doing this in the 2000s, and now all of a sudden, everybody is talking about decolonization and resisting Western cultural imperialism and trying to erase the influences of Western modernity from our themes. We were ahead of the curve, right? Would they feel this way? So, and that leads me to the second, the paper by Dr. Yusuf, I guess, the one on dancing bodies. Yes. The first question is very simple. I'm trying to understand your use of the satirical element in these dances. I might have missed it, but I would like a clarification from you. What is satirical about these dances? When I saw the video that you played, I saw quite a serious dance, to be honest with you, that seemed to me to, like you rightly said in your presentation, to complement the theme of the movie, right? I didn't see a satirical performance per se. So it's in your title, but also you mentioned it in the course of your presentation. And I would just like to see you clarify the satirical element. And then lastly, this form of dance that we saw, that you played briefly for us, I don't know if you've read the work of Brian Larkin on the influence of Indian music and Indian artistic forms in Kannywood. But when I was watching this movie, it occurred to me that the Kannywood has transcended what Dr. Larkin studied in the 1990s, right? Kannywood has gone way beyond that because he was looking at the dances in those movies, in the early Kannywood movies, certainly, like you were saying, were influenced by Indian music and Indian dances, but not this one that we've seen. So I'm asking you, how would you characterize this dance? Is it a hybrid of the Indian influence and more hip hop, more Afrobeat type influences? How would you theorize it? Because I think this is critical to your research and to your paper. You need to find a language for it. You need to find a theory for it that is original to you. So I'm encouraging you to take ownership of it and to help us understand what we are seeing. Thank you very much.
So I'll begin with Dr. McCain.
Okay, I'll try to remember everything. That was a lot to respond to, but I'll start with your question because it's the most immediate on my mind. And yes, I mean, I don't think the filmmakers themselves were thinking about decolonization. They were thinking about rabble and being oppressed and so on. But I do think that Shakarao, Rabo, you know, they were consciously using that language. I mean, when I had the interview with Rabo, you know, he's talking about colonialism and imperialism. So they were actually, so yes, maybe they were ahead of the trend. I would say that still, you know, I still think they were using it. They were using it in a kind of cynical way, right? So they believed that they were decolonizing, but they were also, you know, using it in an ethnocentric way that actually was contrary to what decolonization should be. So I think the censors themselves were actually conscious, and you know, the establishment of Sharia too very clearly was saying, let's get rid of this corrupt colonial law that was brought up by the British and go back to our own Sharia system that was in place. So the Sharia law is very, you know, you can draw a very straight line between that and decolonization. And then the censorship language continued on with that. The filmmakers themselves, I don't think they weren't thinking about colonialism. They were thinking about this very present oppression that they were experiencing. So in terms of, I mean, the name of the panel is decolonization. So I was really struggling to try to get it to fit. But I do think that the censors themselves were very consciously using this sort of framework. Just the idea of being secret, making something more enjoyable, I think absolutely, right? The censors board was trying to suppress things, but it just made people want to seek these things out. So like the video CD that was anonymous, but everybody could recognize the voices of the musicians, right? That kind of makes it something that you really want to see. If it's banned, then and censorship may have worked a little bit better when it was first implemented, but by the time this crisis happened, there was YouTube, there was Bluetooth, where people were forwarding around these banned songs. So they actually became quite a hot commodity. So I think that you're right, that the censorship board was trying to suppress things, but they actually made it more popular. There was a slide that I didn't show where the censorship board actually published photos of actresses, you know, wearing tank tops and things like that to show how corrupt they were. But they were doing the exact opposite. They claimed they were trying to protect people, vulnerable people from these influences, but they themselves were like printing it in the newspaper to show people. And so what exactly were they doing, right? What were the other questions here? I could, well, anyway, I'll leave that for the satirical. There are really good examples of satirical dances in Ibro's films that were also part of the censorship, right? So Ibro got put in prison for some of his satirical dances and songs that he actually didn't sing. It was somebody with a different voice who was singing them. Sorry, I wrote too many notes and I'm having a hard time. So the question about whether yeah, so I would say, yeah, so obviously the Kannywood films are very influenced by Indian films. As you already mentioned, Brian Larkin has written a lot about that, and it's very clear, right? You go, some of the films even have ending closer, the Indian Nights and so on. But I would go back to some of the interviews I did with people. So if you look at what the censors are defining as culture, right, they're looking at some sort of idealized culture that is pre-colonial, and they're trying to preserve that. And you know, there's a reason for that. But then when I asked filmmakers and musicians, what do you think of as what is culture? One of them said, culture is this. If I'm knocking on this table right now, that's my culture. What I experience, what I do. So the Indian films themselves, like now there's Indian Nights, right? I don't know if they're still doing those for weddings and so on. So it's become this interesting part of Hausa culture, so that when you go to the north and you hear that music, you're like, oh, this is Hausa music. So it is. I mean, I understand the concern. In fact, I think some filmmakers themselves say they're worried about the disappearance of traditional dancing and singing. And I think if you'd been able to play that dance from Maria, right, there is kind of a conscious effort in some of the films to go back and have some of that traditional dancing. Yeah, like the film of Balaraba Rama Yakubu was set historically. So I think filmmakers themselves often consciously try to go back and do these cultural productions. If I'm not answering someone's question, you're gonna have to remind me because there was a lot to remember. Yeah, but let the others speak. Yeah.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes.
You can remember what I said.
Yes.
The point I was trying to make was that, you know, Hausa society, they have their own culture. Before the Kannywood culture, now we have, they have their own, well, I would call it traditional Kannywood, because we have traditional dramatists that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Before, in the 90s, 2000s, we started seeing Kannywood. So the infiltration of Indian movie into this country after 1970s, that's what gave us what we see as Kannywood today. So what I'm saying, even when there was what some people are considered as conservative, there are room for drama, there are room for dances, but the Kannywood China. The Kannywood China is a new innovation into the house culture. And since it now despite the fact that it has a wider acceptance and understanding. So the point I was trying to make is to look at it as a kind of decoloniality. It's like which I think I understood what the people are very good at is to go ask how the culture within the video or traditional.
Sorry, I think, sorry, I intervene. Yeah, I think there's a mix up here.
Yeah.
Her position is to demonstrate the tension that existed between the states and these filmmakers within the context of decoloniality. Yeah, that's what she, and to see how both the state officials and the filmmakers were able to frame, you know, and understand the idea of decoloniality in the context of Kannywood films. I think that's.
Yeah, I think it is interesting because in like the 30s and 40s, right, the traditional Hausa culture was seen as you know, it's in Savongari, you go to that. So those traditional dances were also lumped in with the barracks. You go to those places to enjoy those traditional dances. And then in the 1970s, with kind of the wave of decoloniality, those things started becoming, we're proud of them, right? Because this is Hausa culture. And so now when the Indian films come, then those are, you know, that becomes a worry that they're pushing aside the traditional culture. So at each stage, there's been this wave of anxiety about them. But I think the current Kannywood filmmakers, yes, I mean, there's the Indian style dancing and singing, but I think as you pointed out, it's not like the dance she showed is not purely Indian anymore. It's become its own thing. And a lot of the filmmakers are trying to show traditional music and dancing, even if it's kind of become Kannywoodized.
Yes.
But there are those discussions happening, I think. And there are quite a few films that are trying to show traditional culture, even though, you know, they're eating apples and things like that. That didn't actually exist. But
Thank you. I want her to answer questions. All right, please go ahead.
Thank you. I would like to say that this is a work in progress, and I have noted all of your observations. The question Prof posed to me, and the doc over there is talk about the classification. For me, the dances that have shown are creative dances, they are innovative dances, they are modern dances that are speaking to the issues that these people are trying to portray to the audience. And when we talk about creative dances, these are movements that have been carefully put together to be able to speak, to be able to express these subject matters. So they are not like the everyday Koroso dance, the everyday Shantu dance, and all of that. That is one thing about the classification, and I will equally go deeper when it comes to having to give a broader perspective on what creative dances are. Because these films are even, they are recent films. One is in 2018 and the other one is in 2022. So for the fact that they are portraying some of the things that is happening in the society, they also need a dance that can equally complement or speak directly to the issues. Then somebody talked about the idea of satirical. For me, within the context of this work, I see satire from the perspective of having to use a form of art to depict some of the norms, some of the immoral behaviors within the society with the intention of having to transform the minds of the viewer. That's the way I conceptualize the concept of satire, and not necessarily having to show comic dances or comic movements, but the subject matter which the dance is being used to explore. That's my conceptualization. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Wonderful presentations from all of you. I want to ask, Prof made a very important observation about the concept of decolonization, considering recent publication by Falola, Gasheni, and some other people that looks at decoloniality or decolonization from different angles, talking about epistemic disobedience, I mean, questioning the received knowledge that we have. And I'm asking whether what we are witnessing is actually decolonization or something else. And if it is decolonization, whether the position of Shakarao, I mean, those in the government officials laying claim to establish rules on how the society and the filmmaker should practice and depict their craft is not politically motivated, instead of having an intellectual undertone. And so my question is, before Shakarao, before the emergence of Islam and the subjugation of traditional Hausa culture, where was this idea of decoloniality? Because it seems we are decolonizing what? I mean, Western culture for Eastern culture, I mean Islamic culture. Then where is Hausa culture in this case? Or are we equating Hausa culture to the Islamic culture in that context? And then you talked about dissenting. I mean, I was hoping that I would see something like, using dance to make a political point or to challenge the status quo. That in Hausa culture, for instance, or in Kannywood or in Kano and some other places, that certain norms, certain traits, certain attitudes are not permissible. But now a new actors or artists are challenging these positions or this culture using dance. That was, what I was thinking. I might be wrong. It is not my area.
Prof, please go ahead. Yeah, please.
I want to say something about the paper by Morodio. Yes, and I want to just express my admiration for the way you approached Rahama Sadao and her, whatever you want to, her cultural subversion, if you will. I want to, because you portrayed her in all the complexity that she embodies. Often when you read most of the literature, when I read most of the literature on these types of controversies, and these types of controversies are very common in northern Nigeria anyway, so I get disappointed. And the reason I get disappointed is that it's often couched or framed as either or. Either someone represents the authentic Islamic tradition, or someone is a rebel against it. And in the case of Rahama Sadao, it's quite difficult to place her in one of those two categories. And I think it's deliberate on her part, because she apologized, but at the same time, the social media that she was accused of using to disrespect the Islamic tradition, she used the same medium to also launch herself into another stratosphere of fame. So I think it's disruption with a method, it's rebellion with a method, it's knowing when to apologize. It's a crafty, sophisticated use of the social media space on her part to not only construct an image of herself, but also to stay within the good graces of her natal culture while doing so. And I think, as a historian, I can place her in a long tradition in Hausa land of, religious rebellion, but also cultural rebellion. People who were in the minorities, people who were not part of the mainstream religious setup in northern Nigeria, always knew how to strategically and carefully and delicately use the resources available to them to challenge the normative system and to express their individuality, but doing so within certain norms so as not to disrupt, but also so as not to be rejected in that culture. And I think Rahama Sadao is the modern incarnation or iteration of that tendency and that tradition. And so I appreciate the way, the complex way in which you treated her. Thank you.
Comments, please, comment.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I want to also add something on this, Dr. Martina, that if you look at the particular case of Rahma Sadao, that shows she is rebellious to the tradition, whether Hausa tradition or Islamic system tradition. If you look at it, Rahma Sadao was not in any way in conflict with the authorities, rather in conflict with her audience or with her listeners or with her people. Because if you could remember a particular case of Rahma Sadao, she just made an outing. Nobody condemned the outing. Even in authorities, nobody condemned her outing. But somebody just commented on the outing. And the comment he made was what attracted the outrages all over the Muslim world. Because the person just commented that this you are dressing, even Prophet Muhammad can admire you. That's what the person commented on her dressing. So that dragged her into the mud. So she had to come out and apologize for that comment. She was not the one that made the comment. And nobody talked about her dressing. Yes, she dresses somehow, contrary to the culture, contrary to the whatever, but nobody commented. But when that person commented in that direction, so she became under fire. And she has to come out and use the same social media that people are condemning her to apologize to people. Look, if you have the clip, you see her crying, destabilized, because the way her listeners, her followers on social media were castigating her, condemning her for the comment that somebody did on her dressing. So maybe if you look at it this way, it may reduce the complexity of how you treat this your issue. And lastly, sorry from my Ken, please try to look at how these authorities you gave consideration in your paper, how they treated the issues in Kannywood while they were in power and their actual conduct after they are out of power. And also, is this Islamic? Is this Hausa? Or is this a common sense? And if we talk of decoloniality on this one, I will not agree with you, Prof, that it's colonialism that brought what contemporary Kannywood picture is trying to destroy. It's not colonialism. Rather, colonialism is what even gave birth to Kannywood. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Okay.
So I just want to react, but I'll say, so I'll just say something very briefly. So controlling and censoring social media is delicate. And I think that was one of the reasons why there was a Twitter ban in Nigeria. because the government answered that, okay, we couldn't control the space, and people are using it to subvert their power and their authority. And so they put it ban. But they needed the same scale to change conversations, to change the narratives. They lifted the ban again. Then another now the point I left out and I wanted to state was that Rahama status case was those sensitive that they use the forces of the state to oppress that. Somebody wrote wrote a petition, and the IGP instructed the police commissioner to look into the case. So the thing was that, is it a criminal case? What was the issue at somebody made a comment that your trending has caused my eye to sting. And then somebody else reacted to that comment. And then an hashtag started trending on Twitter. So she was not directly involved. Then the current form of subversion in Kannywood now. We can see subversion not in Kannywood per se, but in the use of social media, TikTok influencers and TikTok content. So like during this recent election, there was a lot of criticism and the use of caricature, especially among the northern youth. So you could see that they had this popular state. Baba, I remember the face. So they were using it. They did this music and then they will put our current president Tinubu, and they will make a caricature of it falling down, and then they will play the music, and it's trending on TikTok and gathering views. So this is one of the ways they were subverting what they didn't want. Then there was also a particular case where a female TikTok content creator was arrested for doing what she was creating was not different from what the men or the males have been creating. So the fact remains that because of the culture of the state and the social structures in place, we cannot move. It's not like saying you want to see Hausa culture from Islamic culture now. It's almost impossible. It's the same way it affects us in gender relation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thank you for these critical discussions on this panel. I would like to make a couple of comments before we close. The question of authenticity remains a mystery in Canada. And I think a lot of people have actually talked about what is the culture in Canada and how do we see, just like she said, and I've had during the course of this conference, how do you decipher what is northern and how do you decipher what is Islamic? Yeah. And so I talked with Abba, Dr. Abba, a few days ago, and I talked about the Islamization of culture. And he said, what is Islamization of culture? I said, why the people have adopted Islam as their culture? So you talked about the culture, the prehistorical culture, the culture in the prehistorical era in northern Nigeria. I don't know what the culture is before the coming of Islam. I got to Kano and I know that what the practice is Islam in quotes now. So how do we differentiate that?
Okay, between Islam and the Hausa.
Islam and Hausa culture. How do you authenticate what is Hausa culture and what is Islamic? And it goes out, you know, these issues are deep. And when we are talking about Kannywood, we can't talk enough about how the state, how the structure in place is used to suppress people. I'm talking about internal colonization, recolonization by the Hausa people. We are talking about people coming from outside to colonize us. And we are talking about the people with whom we live and sleep, you know, colonizing us. Now, she talked about dissenting bodies and all of these things. The dances shown in the first clip could not have been shown a couple of years ago. Yeah. More so by a female wearing a, you know, tight jean and top and a jacket. No, you will not do that. And so it brings us to the discussion on what is private and what is public. within the context of northern Nigeria. All of these issues, sir, with all due respect, I know you are from the north and you must try desperately to protect what is yours. But now we are in a discussion. This is, an avenue to generate knowledge and to rebel. And so all of these things have to be there, whether we like it or not. Now we're talking about the cancel culture of Rahama Sadao. That was not the first offense Rahama Sadao, offense in quotes now, Rahama Sadao was going to commit. Rahama Sadao did a video with classic. And so as a video victim, my idea of a video victim is not what was portrayed of Rahama Sadao in that video. My idea of a victim coming from a background as metropolitan as Lagos is contra distinction to what the portrayal and representation of Rahama Sadao. And so you said that the state did not have an entry into whatever justice or whatever criticism Rahama Sadao received. I say no. Rahama Sadao was banned because she held classes in that video. And it was that ban that led her to the global Hollywood. Now, the people of Kano themselves have, they are prostituted, pardon that word, the use of that word, the Hollywood, the Bollywood, making it Kannywood. So how do you, differentiate what is yours and what is not yours? Now, they try to, we know what Sabongari is meant for. All of the vices are meant to be dropped in Sabongari. But most of these vices that are dropped in Sabongari are perpetrated by the people within the walls of Kano itself. And so, sir, I think that we should be critical and, be objective. It is not a religious discourse. You get it? It is more of cultural, and this is a discussion that we really have to, it's a lingering conversation. And as it is now, as I sat here, I was saying something in my mind. The film industry in limbo, that is what Kannywood is. Frightening of the filmmakers. We have to know that filmmakers are in filmmaking to make money, and they have to do what the audience would like. Now, how do you want the filmmakers to go back to, the pre-colonial era, when the people of Kano traveled out and get, to meet other cultures? And these have helped in, in the formation of their mindset of who they are. And you come back to Kannywood and you see what has been happening 100 years before now. No, they won't get further. So what is the topic? We have Netflix. We have Netflix, right? We have Netflix. Do you know what that is? Netflix, belonging, a streaming platform belonging strictly to the northern part of Nigeria. So what happens on Netflix? And it might interest you to know that the COVID has changed the dimension and dynamism of viewership. Now, somebody talked about how do you censor YouTube movies. The present head of ISBA, the censorship board in Kano, decried a few weeks ago that they would look for the perpetrators, those who go directly online, to upload their films and jail them. And that has been the tradition. They have been silenced, historical silencing. They have been jailed severally. They have been harassed, they have been fined. And Professor McCain mentioned in a presentation that Kannywood filmmakers had to be exiled, self-exiled, if you like, to Kaduna and neighboring states to make ends to where they come for them. And so I think the challenge of Kannywood is beyond what we can discuss here. It is entrenched in that community, in that society. And until the people who own the society are ready to change, still talking about decolonization. I don't think we as academics can actually solve it. But so far, I would want you to have a self-reflection and be objective about Kannywood. I thank everyone for coming to this panel. Thank you. And we're going to have a part 2 at 3:45.
So, congratulations. Thank you. That was I'm sorry.